This is the story of how the Chinese army beat the U.S. Army in Korea. Men, weapons, and tactics are all part of the story, but mostly it's about character and command. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. For 4 months, the fighting swept down the Korean peninsula and then back up. By October 24th, the Eighth Army had routed the North Koreans and was only 45 miles from the Chinese border along the Yalu River. With U.S. First Corps and Republic of Korea, or ROK, Second Corps, north of the Chongchong River in the west, and the U.S. 10th Corps along the east coast near Hungnam. Unknown to the Eighth Army, there were 6 army groups of Chinese People's Liberation Army, or PLA, hiding in the hills and forests of North Korea. The PLA was poorly armed. Less than half the men had rifles or submachine guns. They had very few machine guns and mortars, and almost no artillery. But they made up for the lack of firepower with driving nighttime attacks. They came on under cover of darkness in tight columns until their enemy opened fire. Then they broke into small groups and closed in. The groups in front used grenades. Following them came soldiers with submachine guns, and then came riflemen. And they kept coming. If the lead groups failed, the groups right behind them pressed the attack. A PLA battalion attack on a U.S. company might use 27 squads, one after the other, along a front only 20 to 30 yards across. One Chinese leader called it sticking a long, sharp, pointed knife into the enemy's weak spot. And anywhere they could, the PLA worked into the gaps between defending units and tried to get behind them to make them pull back or even break and run. Every combat soldier in the U.S. Army had a weapon and was backed by a big supply of machine guns, mortars, automatic rifles, and recoilless rifles. Tanks and artillery added a lot more firepower. And American units could not just shoot, they could move. A U.S. Army regiment had almost 450 trucks and jeeps to carry soldiers, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. With all that motor power, a regiment could sustain itself for some time when it was defending or attacking and cover many miles moving up to a fight or away from one. But for all its strengths, the U.S. Army had problems. On the defense, units spread out across too much countryside, each on its own hill, too far away to help one another. On the attack, they often moved too fast to bring all their firepower into the fight. And commanders were too quick to fall back when the enemy got behind them and too slow to get help to units in trouble. On October 25th, the PLA came out of hiding, attacked the Eighth Army, and drove it 30 miles back across the Chongchong River. They trapped the U.S. 8th Cavalry Regiment at Unsan and tore it apart. Then, after 10 days, they stopped and pulled back north and went into hiding to make good their losses, take on more supplies, and figured out what they had learned about fighting the U.S. Army. They came away from the fight at Unsan confident they could take on the entire Eighth Army and drive it out of North Korea. While the Chinese were rebuilding their forces and learning their lessons, the Eighth Army brought up more divisions and supplies and got ready to go back on the attack. On November 24th, it moved north with 118,000 men, sure that there were now only 70,000 Chinese between it and the Yalu, and that the war was nearly over. In fact, there were now 200,000 PLA soldiers ready for an attack of their own. For 2 days, the Eighth Army pushed north, then the PLA hit them. After dark on November 25th, they struck the ROK 7th and 8th Divisions in the east, the U.S. 25th and 2nd Divisions in the center, and the ROK 1st and U.S. 24th Divisions in the west. On the night of November 25th-26th, the U.S. 2nd Division was spread out in a 12-mile arc north and east of Kujiangdong. The 3 battalions of the 9th Infantry Regiment were in the north. They were backed by the 23rd Infantry Regiment with 2 battalions in close, along with most of a company of tanks and 2 batteries of artillery, and 1 battalion just outside Kujiangdong. The 38th Infantry Regiment's 3 battalions were to the east. The rest of the division's artillery was in Kujiangdong. When night came, the PLA's 120th Division, with as many as 9,000 men, broke through the 3rd Battalion 9th Infantry's defenses, rolled over the artillery and infantry behind them, and set up on a hill that commanded the division's rear. The 113th PLA Division hit the 38th Infantry hard in the hills around Samindong. The Chinese kept hitting at the 2nd Division for 2 nights. They cut off companies, attacked command posts, and wore down the fighting strength of the infantry battalions. The 9th Infantry was hurt worst. Its 2nd Battalion started the fight along the Chongchong with 780 men. After 3 days of fighting, it was down to 260. The Chinese battered the 2nd Division, but failed to break it. By the night of November 27th-28th, most of the division was in tight defenses, backed by artillery, and holding its own. But it was in trouble. The PLA 38th and 42nd Armies were moving from the east to cut the 2nd Division off and wipe it out. The 39th Army was trying to get behind it from the west, and the 40th Army was sending more men against it from the north. On November 28th, the U.S. 8th Army ordered the 2nd Division to withdraw. The plan was to pull back 15 miles to Kunu-ri that day, and on the next day move another 20 miles to Sunchan before the Chinese could cut the road there. The 2nd Division's commander was Major General Lawrence B. Kaiser. He graduated from West Point in 1917, a classmate of Lawton Collins, who was Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army during the Korean War. He was a battalion commander in the First World War and won a Silver Star fighting in France. He graduated from the Army's top school for field commanders just before the Second World War. In that war, he was the Chief of Staff of an Army Corps in North Africa and Italy. But he was sent back to the United States early in 1944 and never got a combat command. He was an advisor in China in 1948 when the PLA was fighting the Nationalist Army. He took over the 2nd Division 5 months before the start of the war in Korea, brought it into the fight around Pusan, and then took it up to the Chongchong River. General Kaiser's division was south of Kunu-ri by the night of November 28th-29th. Its 3 infantry regiments held off the Chinese to the north. The artillery was just south of them, and the division command post, or CP, was 6 miles to the south, along with the engineer, anti-aircraft, and tank battalions. The Chinese were still pressing in from the north and east. The regimental combat team was basic to the 2nd Division's fighting power. It combined an infantry regiment, a battalion of artillery, 2 companies of tanks, and a company of anti-aircraft artillery, which was very strong against targets on the ground. A PLA regiment was a match for a U.S. regiment in men, but in the weapons that did the real killing work, machine guns, mortars, artillery, and tanks, it was massively outgunned. The difference in firepower made the 2nd Division's 3 regimental combat teams a match for 12 PLA regiments in the attack or in a running fight, and for at least twice that number on defense. The 2nd Division was not at full strength. It was down about 1,900 men by November 30th, but it still had nearly all of its machine guns, mortars, artillery, and tanks. It was in contact with parts of 2 PLA armies with a total of 18 regiments, 9 to the north and 9 to the east. But the PLA had been hammering at the Americans for days. They had taken their own losses, and in the east they were struggling to close with the 2nd Division through rugged terrain. At most, the 2nd Division was fighting 10 damaged PLA regiments. The 2nd Division's road out of the trap ran down a half-mile wide valley lined by low hills on either side. 12 miles south of Kunu-ri, the valley narrowed, and the road went through a pass with steep walls 50 feet high and 450 yards long. Beyond the pass, the road forded a stream and carried on to Sunchan. By morning on the 29th, the trap door was swinging shut. Moving overland, the PLA 113th Division was already south of Kunu-ri. It set up a fire block in the pass, covering the road with machine gun and mortar fire. The 2nd Division's road out of the trap. Through the morning of the 29th, the 2nd Division made a series of attacks against the fire block in the pass, with a reconnaissance company, an infantry company, and a tank platoon supported by a battery of artillery. The attacks failed, leading the division to think the PLA were in the pass in battalion strength, about 600 men, 26 machine guns, and 12 mortars. During the night of November 29th-30th, the PLA put in a second fire block a mile south of the 2nd Division CP. They also took the CP under fire from a distance with mortars and machine guns. The 3 U.S. regiments in the north held steady against attacks by the PLA 40th Army. On November 30th, the 2nd Division had 3 options. One was to stay, that is, pull into a tight defense, hold off the Chinese attacks, and wait for help from 8th Army units to the south. There were strong units nearby able to help, but the 8th Army had ordered a retreat and was no more willing to rescue the 2nd Division than it had been to help the 8th Cavalry a month before at Unsan. Another option was to fight, use 1 regimental combat team to hold in the north and 2 to attack south, drive the Chinese out of their fire blocks, clear the road for the rest of the division, and open the way to Sunchan. The other option was to run, have a regimental combat team hold in the north while the rest of the division got on trucks and tanks and tried to race through the fire blocks and escape to the south. This is how General Kaiser saw things. My impression was that we were seriously confronted by an aggressive enemy which had moved across our rear, but the division had to withdraw quickly or take terrible losses where it stood. From what I saw and heard, I concluded that the enemy had already built up considerable strength all around us. At first, Kaiser decided to fight. He sent about 800 men from the 9th Infantry and the South Korean Army, along with some tanks, but without any artillery support, to drive the PLA soldiers out of the fire blocks south of the division CP. The Chinese beat back 1 attack and then another. By noon, the fire blocks were still there, and that's when Kaiser decided to run. The plan was for the 38th Infantry to take the lead, to be followed by the division command group with General Kaiser riding in a jeep. Then came the 17th Field Artillery Battalion, a battalion of the 9th Infantry, and the 37th, 38th, and 503rd Field Artillery Battalions. The division's Combat Engineer Battalion was to wait and move south behind the artillery. There was no plan to use any of its bulldozers or bulldozer tanks to help keep the road open. Anti-aircraft guns were scattered through the units on the road to help give covering fire. The 23rd Infantry, formed as a regimental combat team, was to hold off the Chinese long enough for the rest of the division to get clear and then make a fighting retreat, following along behind. All morning long, more PLA crossed the road. They set up new fire blocks in the hills west of the road and 2 roadblocks made from wrecked American tanks and trucks. At 1 in the afternoon, General Kaiser gave the order, and his soldiers climbed onto jeeps, trucks, and tanks and started south. 1 battalion of the 9th Infantry joined them, along with the South Koreans. The other battalion from the 9th Infantry stayed behind. The front units moved past the first PLA fire blocks without much harm, but when they stopped to clear the first roadblock, PLA machine guns and mortars began to knock men down and trucks out. Tanks pushed the roadblock wrecks off the road, and the division began moving again. But it was slow going. One officer said the division was a solid column of vehicles, with men jammed in and on them wherever they could find a place. Even from a distance, the Chinese fire couldn't miss. When a truck or a jeep stopped because its driver was killed or its engine was crippled or its fuel was set on fire, the entire column came to a halt until the wreck could be moved out of the way. It took 2 hours for the head of the column to go 6 miles and reach the roadblock at the north end of the pass. By 3 o'clock, the PLA had knocked out more than 120 of the 2nd Division's vehicles, and for miles the roadside was lined with dead and wounded U.S. soldiers. With help from airstrikes, the 38th Infantry and the Division Command Group got through the pass by 5 o'clock. The 17th Field Artillery Battalion got through just before dark, around 6 o'clock, losing 1 gun. Not long after, more PLA set in overlooking the pass and the ford. That made it much harder for the battalion of the 9th Infantry and the 37th Field Artillery Battalion that followed. They made it through, but the artillery lost 10 of its 18 guns. With 5 anti-aircraft guns blasting open the way, the 503rd Field Artillery Battalion came through the pass, but stalled at the ford, which was blocked with wrecks. Jammed up behind the 503rd Field Artillery Battalion, the 38th Field Artillery Battalion was trapped on the road. The artillerymen of both battalions had to leave all 36 of their guns on the road and try to get to Sunchan cross-country. The last battalion of the 9th Infantry and the Engineer Battalion were at the end of the line, but they were trapped in the dark on a road choked with wrecks. The PLA came down out of the hills and wiped them out. The 23rd Regimental Combat Team held off the PLA attacking from the north all day long. By late afternoon, their commander saw that the way south was blocked, so he fired all of his artillery rounds, destroyed his cannons, and slipped away to the west. By midnight, the regiment was safe at Sukchan. The 2nd Division had almost 5,000 killed, wounded, and missing during the second half of November, a third of its starting strength. 3,000 of those casualties happened in 8 hours on the road from Kunu-ri. It lost nearly all of its artillery and many trucks. The division was out of action for weeks. The PLA did the damage to the 2nd Division, but General Kaiser made mistakes that made it much worse. General Kaiser did not know his enemy. The PLA thrived on night attacks against scattered units. He let the 9th and 38th Infantry spread out and expose themselves to just those kind of attacks on November 25th and 26th. He had few excuses for not knowing how the PLA fought. His own experience in China and the 8th Cavalry's mauling at Unsan in October gave him plenty of chances to learn PLA tactics. He did no reconnaissance on November 30th. He had no idea where the first PLA fire block was, where the roadblocks were, or how strong his enemy was in the pass. He thought the PLA were all around him, but he didn't find out where or in what strength. General Kaiser's attack against the fire block just south of the CP was too weak. The 9th Infantry and the Koreans were in bad shape. They needed extra support, but they got no help at all from the division's most powerful weapons. There were 3 battalions of artillery and 2 companies of anti-aircraft guns waiting on the road to the north. None of them got into the fight to clear the first fire block. He didn't use any of his artillery for covering fire once the move south got underway. General Kaiser waited too long to give the order to mount up and head south. By the time the division got moving, there were only 5 hours of daylight left. With wrecks slowing the long column to a walking pace and no engineering equipment in place to clear the way, the division ran out of light and time. General Kaiser left his division on its own, without a commander, when he got in his jeep and headed south. That put him out of radio contact with most of his units most of the time. When Kaiser arrived at the pass, he grabbed a rifle, started shooting at the Chinese, and shouted, "We're beginning to get them on the run. We've got to get through here before dark." It was a brave thing to do, but it was fighting, not commanding. It wasn't his duty or even his job. The 2nd Division's ordeal south of Kunu-ri was not for lack of strength. It had plenty of combat power left at noon on November 30th, or for lack of courage. Its soldiers kept together and kept fighting until they were overwhelmed, but for lack of a commander. General Kaiser was relieved and sent home. The new 8th Army chief, Matthew Ridgway, trying to understand how to fight the PLA better, wrote General Kaiser asking what had happened along the Chongchong River and on the road south of Kunu-ri. Kaiser never replied.